So without further ado, today we kick off with a keynote address by Professor Kefa Otiso from Bowling Green State University. He's going to he's going to share with us his thoughts on Africa-US cities from the perspective of current landscape, academic, industry and policy partnerships, and lay out what we can expect in the future at the practical scholarly levels. Welcome, Professor Otiso. A round of applause for him. Yeah, no, let me just then finish. I think, no, you welcome. And after Professor Otiso has made his presentation, our discussant today is a young, vibrant, early achiever and a long-term friend of mine. Obviously, Professor Baso Nzenze is head of politics and international relations at University of Johannesburg. But I would like to also mention that he's a PhD graduate from the great University of Witwatersrand. Those of you who are here know that there's some rivalry between WITS and UJ, but it's a friendly match. We compete, but we compete fiercely and cooperate even more fiercely. So I think he will be discussant for today's session, and then we'll take up things from there. And we'll also today try to manage time a little more stridently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for the opportunity for me to be here to talk about this interesting topic. I'm very happy to be at this conference, first time in South Africa. So it's always a great opportunity when these things arise. So I don't know who is in the audience, but I want to start by recognizing everyone. You never know. Looks like I'm standing in front of all the greats of Johannesburg. And so feel welcomed, and I observe all protocols. And with that, I'd like to get into the discussion that we're here. So my topic is going to be looking at Africa-US cities in a global setting and trying to identify some of the research agendas, some of the academia policy practice nexuses, and hopefully getting into some of the future trends. It's a very big topic, so there's no way I'm going to do a very good job, and whatever gaps I leave, Dr. Baso can always fill in. He's actually the one who is more in line with some of the material that I'm going to be addressing here. So it looks like it's out of focus, but maybe, is that the case? Are people able to see? Or it's looking just fine? Okay, looking just fine. So I didn't want to necessarily do one point at a time because it can take long. So I just decided to put everything here. I think the presentation will be available later on, so don't try to write everything, it's not gonna work. And even some of what I have here from my experience, sometimes I end up changing it on the fly. That is generally the nature of the craft that we're in. But if I can set some sort of geopolitical context for Africa-US city relations, especially drawing on the work of Peter's 2022, you'll basically see that we are in the recent maybe 100 years, you're looking at maybe three phases that actually set to frame the discussion that we're having today. One is, of course, 1945-89, where you can look at bipolarity between the US and the former Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union collapses in 1989, creating the second phase of unipolarity, where the US is the only superpower. And that continued until about 2008. By the way, these dates can be a little bit, a little bit fussy. We're not talking of exact like 1945, 2008. Some of these things is actually when it becomes clear that something has happened. So that's when we bracket it with things like 1989. And of course, the Soviet Union 1989 is clear, but 2008, some people will say it can be a little bit earlier, it can be a little bit later. But we do know that this was a period where the US was the only superpower. Since then, we are seeing a complex multipolarity that is involving at least three dominant players, the US, China, and the European Union. And if you break down the complexity, you'll see an emerging Chinese-American bipolarity that is increasingly structuring the world system. remember that when you're talking of phase number 2 of unipolarity, whoever is the superpower sets the rules of global engagement. We are still living in a global capitalist system that is largely run and set up by the United States and institutions from the United States. So as China is rising, what you're beginning to see are institutions from China that are also beginning to structure and challenge US hegemony on the global scene, which is why I put this map graph that you see on the right side. If you look at the global economy, it is basically US still leading with about $20 trillion, followed by China about 13. By the way, this is 2019. If you look at 2022, it is actually something like 25 versus 17 trillion. So the gap is closing rapidly. But the important thing is not to debate the figures. The important thing is to recognize that US is still number 1 and China is rising rapidly, and which actually you see here. So one of the things I tell my students when I look at this graph, I tell them you should see from this very clearly that the so-called global economy is anything but global. You are talking of very few countries basically that are actually running the show. And luckily it's colored by, it has some different colors. So if you look at the purple, which is where Africa is down here, so you'll see that we don't really have much say here. So you have South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt being the only players. But in terms of population, of course, we're a fairly substantial population that is basically barely showing up here on the global stage. So which is, to me, is one of the reasons why we need an Africa-US Cities Summit to be looking at how we can elevate our place on the global economy. Because, you know, the global economy is actually run from cities. There are 3 command centers of the global economy. It's mostly New York, London, and Tokyo, and increasingly, of course, Shanghai. And so Shanghai never used to be anywhere here, by the way. If you look at Shanghai around the last 20 years or so, you'll see that actually even international airline connections used to be very small, but actually it rose very rapidly to where now you see it beginning to be at the top. But in any case, then number 2 is a regional political military powers like Russia and Turkey that are trying to be powerful as well. By the way, you need to understand that the Soviet Union was never an economic threat to the United States. It has never been. It is a superpower in military terms, but it has never been a superpower in economic terms. It's actually a fairly small economy. If you remove the nukes, there's not a whole lot to worry about from Russia, okay? So it has never really challenged the US in terms of economic hegemony. So therefore, you see Russia and Turkey, these are some of the small bulls. Some of you are from South Africa, you know, if you're keeping a herd, you see some small bulls here and there that are trying to challenge the dominant bull of the herd. They don't really do a whole lot. They're running around, they're making noise, but they don't really count for a whole lot. And by the way, the reason I bring that up is you need to understand that you cannot be a superpower without, number 1, a very large economy, which is what pays for a very large military, which is what gives you big influence. They always go in that order. So Russia only has number 2, but without the big economy, therefore, whatever it's doing is not sustainable. And the reason you need to worry about this graph is that because China is so big, it can afford to pay for a very big military. And the bigger it gets, the bigger the military it's likely to pay for, which is actually why China is the real challenger to US hegemony on the global scene. Nobody has come close in the last 100 years. And even in the United States, when you begin to lose economic hegemony, what tends to happen is that you begin to over-rely on your military, which is actually what you see the US doing right now. And some people would say that actually US is beginning to decline because of the over-reliance that we're beginning to exert on the military. But at some point, it will become very difficult to pay for the military if the economy begins to falter. And by the way, many countries really don't like to use the military. The military is our last resort. But when you find yourself always using the military, jumping from war to war, it begins to cause a number of issues, even actually affecting your economy in the long term. And then, of course, you have other players like the European Union that you see here, which is a big economic power, but not necessarily a big military power, as it were. Anyway, but then, of course, the BRICS are here, including South Africa, and some people will say even Africa, as it begins to form one economic union, is likely to be a challenge in days to come. That is yet to be seen. Some people would actually argue that really you're looking at one capitalist economy that basically can be broken in 2 phases, the colonial and post-colonial phase, as you see here. And if you look at it that way, then you'll see that there are different historical phases and moments. A colonial one that was involving hard power, whereby Britain and other countries were all over Africa, directly colonizing us. And after that, there is independence, much of which is basically paper independence, which launches a post-colonial phase, of indirect colonialization or neo-colonialism, as you see here. So which is a phase of soft power. It is always more preferable to use soft power to hard power, if you, as much as possible. And so in this environment, then you see, if you were trying to map where Africa is in this scene, especially when you're looking at some of the centers that Prof has invited us here to discuss, I just decided to do an intellectual exercise and see how many centers of African studies we have across the globe. You'll see that most of them are basically in the United States by far. Especially if you're looking at a number of African studies programs. Latin America, hardly anything, but you see that actually the US has the most in this particular case. And then of course we see a lot of them in Africa, but that is expected. I mean, Africans should study themselves. But what I'm talking about here are the African study centers that are outside of the African continent, and you see very clearly that the US leads, followed by Western Europe. So this experiment that Prof has started here is actually unique in the sense that for the first time, we are beginning to return the gaze and begin to look at the superpower that has always studied us. Now we're beginning to study them. But on the African continent, if you look around, there are not too many of them, number one. And number two, even when I saw the launch of US Prof and even one at the University of Nairobi, I monitored social media. There was a lot of noise about, wow, we're wasting taxpayer money studying the US. What the heck can we learn from studying the US? I'm like, you don't understand what you're talking about. You can't be rising and you're not even studying the people that you're supposed to be rivaling, you know? So a lot of us, I think, on this continent are still at basic needs mode level, but actually we don't sometimes understand the significance of some of the work that is being launched today. You notice that when China became important, it started launching Confucius Institutes all over the place. So if you're truly going to be a rising continent, you better begin supporting some of these things because you need to understand your rivals. It's a football game. You better study your rivals as you begin to rise. So here's a map of the places where you have, Africans especially focusing on the US because we are talking of the study of the US. Therefore, we are focusing on Africans in the United States. And you'll see that most of them tend to be in this area here, the historical setting of the African-American population, with a very large presence also in the cities. And this is actually a map I made recently for another project. Most of the sub-Saharan African population is here. And then, of course, look at the same thing by county. Geographers like to go down the scale from the national to the state level to the sub-national level to actually, so if you look at this map, it's very deceptive. And when you go here, you find that this red is actually only Dallas and Houston. So it can give you an impression that Africans are overrunning Texas, which is not the case. They're only in a number of metropolitan areas. And this map will also deceive you into thinking that these small dots that you see here don't really have a big African-American population. No, those are the big metropolitan areas of the United States that collectively actually have a very large population compared to some of the rural areas and counties that you see down here. So then looking at, for example, the distribution of the people of African descent in the US, you'll see very quickly that it's mostly a few countries really that are represented. And if you break it by region, you'll end up seeing that Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Somalia, and Liberia, Morocco, and Cameroon are going to be some of the more important ones in that regard. And of course, if you map them, as I showed earlier, it will look like what you see here. At the state level, it's basically mostly Texas, New York, California, Maryland, Minnesota, and the like that actually have most of the African-born population. So if you're a policymaker right now in this room, what you should be asking yourself is, we're in South Africa, where are the South Africans? If it's Johannesburg, where are the people from Johannesburg? Which cities do they live in? By the way, that data is available, but I'm not going to be able to do it today. But it is available and it can be done. And the county level, it's basically Harris County, Los Angeles, Bronx, Montgomery, Hennepin County, and on and on. And each of these counties is dominated by people from a particular African country, which opens obvious avenues for linkages between the countries of origin and the counties and cities where they remain in the United States. So someone was talking about sister-city relationships. This is basically a map of where you should go if you're trying to form the sister-city relationships, which is also what you see here. You know, it's mostly the big metros, New York, Washington, and on and on. If we focus on even these 36, we will actually do very well because they'll end up giving you most of the Africans in the United States. So what are the big questions? And in the interest of time, I ran through some things very quickly. The starting points, obviously, for academics is looking at the theoretical, methodological, and conceptual approaches. You'll see that from this section on, I'm actually asking more questions than I'm answering because I'm not an expert in all of these areas, but I think my role is to raise the questions, and we have Wits in the room, we have Johannesburg in the room. You guys are going to come together and figure out the answers to some of these things. Of course, I'll play my small role, but it's not my role and responsibility necessary to answer all of them, but I can ask them. Besides, it's easier to ask questions than to answer them anyway, so that's what I'm going to do. Anyway, so the approaches. So as an urban geographer, I'll end up focusing more on mapping some of these historical and contemporary African city ties and seeing which places are represented. Of course, we need to examine the geopolitical and diplomacy ties. What is the place of the Africa-US city ties in current complex multipolarity of that we see across the globe? What is the role of Africa-US cities in the current era of city diplomacy? That one is important because remember, capitalism began in city-states, then it went to states, then it's now beginning to revert back to cities that are actually playing a big role on the global economy, like New York, Washington, and the like Johannesburg. And the reason is very simple. It's very difficult to get all South Africans to agree on what the South African policy should be. So therefore, smaller units like Johannesburg can actually be more effective in defining their interests and actually expressing those to the global society that we find ourselves. In the United States, those of you that are from that country, you know that our Congress has basically, it's basically paralyzed. We can't have any immigration policy to pass anyway at this particular point. So therefore, smaller units of governments are actually the ones that are running immigration policy, even though, by the way, legally, they are not supposed to do that. That is the role of the federal government. But if the federal government has actually, reached a state of stalemate, then of course, the smaller units have to step in. Somebody said here very accurately yesterday that cities end up having all the problems without budgets of the national governments. And plus, a mayor, you don't have an option but to actually make sure the water is running. A president can basically say, we are setting up a commission to study this big problem in South Africa, and it buys you 5 years of doing nothing. But a mayor of Johannesburg does not have that luxury. So you have to think on your feet and come up with some of these issues. So that even in this geopolitical environment, you have to ask yourself, what is the role of these ascending quote unquote city-states in the current global economy? And how are they going to manage their affairs? So does China's rise mean that US-Africa city relations are going to be impacted? If so, how? And if Africa itself forms its own continental trade bloc, how is that going to impact these Africa-US city relations? Is it going to be a case where this continent begins to look inward, or is it actually going to continue investing in some of these relationships that we are seeing and the ones that actually we're studying in this particular case? And so the socio-economic ties is a long list of things. What are the social, cultural, and economic ties between Africa and the US cities? What are the enablers? One of the enablers is obviously airline networks, as you see on this particular map. And so these, in fact, happen to be some of the key intermediaries, the key nodes of Africa-US cities relationships. And all of the ones on African continent have an airline, a national airline that flies to the US. And the ones on the US side have an African airline that goes there, as well as an American airline that actually flies from there to an African city. So these are the important nodes of this interaction. And the enablers are basically the airline networks. Of course, there is a communications network that I would have actually mapped, but which I didn't have time to put on here. Communications are not very difficult. Everybody's on WhatsApp nowadays. Everyone is on the internet. And remember, the global economy is a little bit conflicted because it enables free flow of goods, services, and capital, but not the free flow of people. Yeah. So that is actually the biggest challenge. We like to call it a global economy, but it restricts the movement of people. And yet, the purpose of any economy is to meet the needs and wants of people, but we restrict the movement of what? Of people. Okay? So the reason I focused on airlines is because they move people. You can actually do shipping networks as well, which would actually also give you a different view. But what I'm suggesting is, since you have a big airport here in Johannesburg, and you have a very big airline here, South African Airways, talk to South African Airways, let them tell you who flies, where do they fly to, what is your passenger mix, because these are the people that will tell you, and they're basically carrying the message from Johannesburg to the rest of the globe. And so what message are you passing to the rest of the globe through some of these airline networks, okay? And of course, other African countries may actually learn from these, cities that you see here. There are a lot of political ties. I'm not going to get enough time to run through them. So looking at, for example, the question of power, are we actually talking about true partnership between African and US cities? Or is it a lopsided relationship? So, and if that is the case, how do we fix some of these things? How do we prepare Africans to be able to do more and actually drive the agenda of Africa-US city relationships? What can we learn from the recent US-Africa summit? Notice that what we had recently was not an Africa-US summit. It was a US-Africa what? Summit. But we are discussing here Africa-US city relationships. Don't get the directionality mixed up. It's extremely important. If it's a US-Africa summit, it is being run by the United States for American interests. And of course, you get to be invited. And actually, if you haven't had time to reflect on the US-Africa summit, there were a number of things that actually disappointed people. For example, there was no agenda that was circulated ahead of time. The US will never do that when it's talking to Chinese and everyone else. But when it comes to the African continent, and by the way, that is not a critique of the US. That is a critique of African leaders of state who actually show up in Washington at the invitation of Washington without asking for an agenda. What are we coming to discuss? Or are you just doing a joyride to Washington? You sleep in a hotel. The US will put all the, I was in Washington at the time. They put out the carpet. They blocked all streets off. And some of these fellows were like, hey, I'm so important. Look, the US has blocked off streets for me. But what have you achieved for Kenya? What have you achieved for South Africa when you are there? So these are very important things. You always have to look at power and how power is moving, yeah, and how it's distributed, yeah. So that we can actually spend our whole time talking about the strengths and failures and successes of the US-Africa summit. Of course, the US will give it a different spin, but what I'm trying to critique here is what is the Africa take on that summit, and what did it achieve for the African continent? And then, of course, there are the military ties, but you can also ask a very simple question. Is it American security that is being protected by AFRICOM, or is it African security that is protected by AFRICOM? Of course, there are places of intersection. You guys know that. Actually, we just co-edited a book where two guys did a very nice essay on AFRICOM is basically for the interest of the US, and actually somebody did the opposite essay that actually it's serving important African interests, which is the case. But it's our responsibility to critique these things and actually make sure that in fact it is. And if it doesn't serve our interests, then we have a responsibility to make sure that it does. So I'm not very good at throwing very heavy stones, but I'm very interested in making sure that if we are talking of partnership, it better be what? A partnership, okay? And so even as Africans, you have a responsibility to make sure that actually there is a partnership. You just can't keep throwing stones at the United States when you don't show up and prepared. And even when you show up and prepared. You show up without a notebook. Meanwhile, everybody on the American side has a notebook, they are writing stuff, and you're simply sitting there, And the question becomes, what the heck did you come to do there? I'll try to be more diplomatic next time. Then there is the knowledge exchanges in terms of Africa-US cities, and I'm going to talk about the Carnegie program later in the day, and I need to keep moving because we're running out of time. So the other thing is obviously the diaspora. This is the resource that is heavily underutilized. Much of the African diaspora in the US, whether you're talking of the older diaspora or the new diaspora, almost always has a conflicted relationship with African countries. There are very few African countries that are genuinely interested in engaging the diaspora. They talk a lot, but they don't, and they love the money, you love the remittances that we send, but you don't really like us a whole lot. And I've always, when I talk to policymakers, including even my own president and people at that level, I tell them, look, if you like me, and you treat me like you actually care for me, you'll get everything I have, including my checkbook. But if you go straight to my pocket, there is a name we use for that, but because we're in polite company, I'm not going to say it. Okay, but I think you get the point. So don't just pay attention to remittances. And by the way, financial remittances are not the most important from a diaspora perspective. Skills and other things are more important. If you want to understand the Chinese miracle, you have to understand the role of the Chinese diaspora and what the Chinese government has done to actually make sure that the Chinese diaspora contributes to China's rise. Same as India, same as Israel. There is no African country that has come close to replicating what the other countries have done in terms of using their diaspora. So if you're talking of Africa-US cities, look up where these Africans are and find where the ones from your country are, and basically start working with them to set up the relationships that you're looking for. I can sell Kenya far more effectively than most of the ambassadors, and we're talking of citizen diplomacy, and that is something I've told every ambassador who has come to Washington. I've always told them, I'm more effective at this job than you are. You are more effective at representing Kenya to the US government, but not representing Kenya to American citizens. I do that more effectively in the classroom every day than you. And we need to think along those lines if we actually want to be able to move this thing a little bit forward. Anyway, there's a long list of things here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you see we already have sister city relationships. We can spend a lot of time discussing them in terms of what is the trade linkages between, for example, this relationship here. That's why I was asking for data yesterday. It is good to have a sister city relationship, but I'm a numbers guy. I like to know, now that we have a relationship, how much trade ties are flowing back and forth between us, okay? And of course, to have this thing work, you need a successful and reliable power, transport, and communications infrastructure. I'm coming to an end here. Power, I don't need to say anything. We're in South Africa, but luckily, I'm told that load shedding ended like 2 days ago. I hope they're serious, But when you bring guests from all over the globe and the lights go out, what is the message you have just sent? And you're trying to tell these people to come and invest. And you started the meeting with the lights on, and 2 minutes later, the lights went out. And you're telling somebody to invest $200 million in a factory that requires a lot of power. In the United States, this guy, the same factory, has actually 3 different power outlets that come to the factory to make sure that if this line fails, there are 2 more as backups. There are some machines that cannot be turned off once you turn them on. They always have to power them. They always have to be heated at a certain level. Otherwise, you lose a $300 million machine. So it's far more than just, the power just went out, and you come on TV and make excuses for power going out without realizing that actually you are burying the dreams of your country and the generations to come. And the same can be said of power, transport, communications. Communication is actually doing relatively well, but transport is a problem. I could spend an entire hour talking about this map here, a colonial railway map, where there is no railway line that basically crosses the continent. There are like 6, 7 different gauges. You're trying to trade with an American company. They ship something, they say it to here, and for you to get it from here to East Africa, you have to go 3, 4, 5, 6 different railway gauges. This map is far more important than you think. Africa is one of the few continents with no inland water transport system. Europe has very navigable rivers. The US has very navigable rivers. Africa does not. Even the mighty Nile is not navigable, except for local stretches of time. South America is the other one. So our best next thing is not rivers, but it's actually railway lines, which is why we need transcontinental railway lines on 1 gauge, not 6, on 1 gauge, and we needed it yesterday. We're already behind the curve, but we don't have these things. So Tanzania wants to do its thing, Kenya wants to do its thing. When are we going to get these people sitting together to actually make sure we can actually have 1 line that runs from East Africa to Lagos? Same thing with roads, and on and on. Okay, future trends very quickly. I apologize, I think I've gone like a minute over or 2. This multipolarity is not going anywhere. So what game are we going to play as we are trying to advance these Africa-US city partnerships? The keynotes of Africa-US city relationships are already formed. It is the cities that you see here. What can we learn from them? What can they teach those that don't have some of these nodes that you see here in terms of airline networks? And how do we make sure that the connection between Joburg and New York is actually going to spread across the United States? You saw the other day Kenya Airways and South African Airways trying to come together to form a more formidable airline. But actually, each of these airlines can actually be very effective if they were effectively managed. You just need to learn from Ethiopian Airways. You can't claim that you can't run an airline when Ethiopian Airways is running a very effective and very profitable airline. So when are we going to learn to basically stop appointing political appointees who know nothing to very key strategic positions like running things like airlines, just because it's your cousin, yeah? And then you end up barring an entire country just to give your one cousin a job, you know? And then of course, African integration will continue. How will this affect Africa-US city relationships? Maybe it actually, and this is the last thing I'm gonna say, I don't think that it's going to affect it in the immediate term because we still do not have effective transport linkages within the African continent. We do have communications, by the way. The cell phones are doing a wonderful job. But we still we need internet-worked roads, internet-worked railway lines. The airlines have actually started to do a good job, but air traffic is mostly for the elites. The groundswell is going to be moving people by road and by railway effortlessly from Cape Town to Cairo. Thank you. I think I took your time, Prof. I'm sorry.